and we still have quite a lot to cover. So, in an attempt to kind of cover up or cover the whole rest of the thing and summarize as we finish here, we're going to try and zoom through to chapter 31. And I have roughly one question based on each chapter here. But as always, we'll cover what we can cover, and if we get sidetracked, then so be it. But we'll do our best to run through the last part of the book here and summarize. Secondly, it's been a privilege getting to do this with you guys. You guys really care about reading 1 Samuel and learning from it, and I appreciate that so much. You know, your enthusiasm and your questions and your comments have been really encouraging to me. And I know they're encouraging to each other as well, so thank you for that. But a short summary of the material that we're going to try and cover today is that, the story so far is David is on the scene now, and he's essentially on the run from Saul until the end of the book. Right, and he's on the run from Saul, and eventually we see Saul engage the Philistines in battle, and he dies, and that's kind of the end of his story. And we're kind of left on a little bit of a cliffhanger until 2 Samuel. Right, 1 and 2 Samuel are really kind of one work divided into two in our English Bibles, so there's not as much of a divide there, but we are left hanging a little bit at the end of 1 Samuel. And then, towards the end, David makes a successful raid, if you will, to go and get the wives and the spoil that has been stolen by the Amalekites, or the Amalekites, however you want to say it. And he brings all that back. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about that towards the end of class. I'm not sure what the status of our PowerPoint is going to be this morning. I know I'm waving around the stick, but we don't know how well that's going to work. So I'm just going to read the questions that I prepared off. I see a couple people with sheets. They have the questions, so that's good. We'll just work off of that. They should be the same on here.
There are others at the back.
Okay, and there are others at the back as well, if you want to grab one, or I can bring one to you. But our very first question from chapter 21 that I want to ask is, why is David not punished for taking this bread of the presence in chapter 21? Right, this is the story of David. He comes to Nob, to the priest Ahimelech, and all he's got is the bread of the presence. And David eats that bread with his men. Right, and under normal circumstances, this is presumably not okay. But we don't see any sort of comment on that incident here. And then David just goes on his way. So what do we think about this whole storyline here?
Well, we know that David is on the run. He and his men are hungry, and he doesn't ask for this bread. He asked for common bread. And so the priest says there is none of that, but there is this. And he asks if they are unclean or if they are clean. And so that's the way the priest approaches it. And it's interesting. And I think it's comparable to Jesus and the disciples gathering the grain as they're walking through the fields on the Sabbath. The need overrode what might be considered a violation of the law.
Right. I like that you pointed out that David doesn't ask for the bread of the presence first. He just asks for bread. So that's interesting, right? He does that first, and then the priest only has the bread of the presence. So there's that part of it. I think that's a good observation. And then, of course, the grain field and the Pharisees are like, what are you doing? You can't, that's working, right? You can't do that. You're violating the Sabbath. And Jesus has this moment where he says, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. right? And that has always been kind of cryptic to me. I'm like, what does that mean, really? But I think there Jesus is sort of stressing that slavishly following that rule of the Sabbath is kind of missing the greater point of obeying the command to rest that God had given the Israelites.
Is it possible in verse 6 that because the bread was going to be removed as a practice from for the Lord, once it was removed from for the Lord, it was no longer in a sense dedicated to Him and therefore available to be used in a more common practice?
Yeah. That's also interesting too. This kind of happens at the changing of the bread, So maybe this was the bread that had just been swapped out. So that's a good point.
Being Lord,
Yeah. Uh-huh.
the enforcers of the law are kind of an exception to the law. Like the priests who violated the Sabbath because they had to burn the sacrifice and chop the wood and all that stuff.
Right.
That's the way I look at that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I like the analogy there. The law enforcement officials have to do things sometimes that aren't legal, I guess. You might say, like speeding to catch up with someone or what have you. And they do that because they're law enforcement professionals, right? They have the training to do that. They have the authority to do that, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's a good point as well. So very good. Okay, that's our first question. Our second question is who... this comes from the very beginning of chapter 22. I'll read it for you here. And David left there, and he escaped to the cave of Adullam. And when his brothers and all his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented, gathered to him. And he became captain over them. Those who were with him numbered about 400. All right, so our second question is, who does this remind you of? Anyone? This should be ringing some bells.
Well, I thought about David's son Absalom, that just later on, he kind of got that back. Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. 2 Samuel 15:6.
Yeah.
And the people at the town, he would say, I wish I had been.
That's actually a really good point. I didn't think of that one at all. But yes, that may be kind of the negative side of that. He's doing some political wheeling and dealing at that point. Absalom is, but yeah, that's a good point.
Well, spiritually speaking, it reminds me of Jesus and the people who are spiritually in debt, spiritually in distress, all those things.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what I was...
Well, and the people who were sick or crippled or something, they all flocked to him to have a miracle performed on them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point as well. But yeah, I mean, right, these are the kinds of people that flock to him. These are the kinds of people that you most often find him with a lot of the times, right? The Pharisees, they have an issue with this. They come to Jesus. Oh, he's got us working over here. Thank you so much. Awesome. But yeah, this description reminds me, and I'm sure others, a lot of Jesus, right? And that's appropriate because David is like this Jesus figure sometimes, right? There are moments where David does something or behaves in a certain way that look an awful lot like Jesus, right? And it sort of, we see the comparison there. I think this sort of shows us that with all his faults, David is a man of the people, right? He's got some things that he's going to have to work through in 2 Samuel. We're also going to come up on some difficult things about David towards the end of the book of 1 Samuel. He does some stuff that is really interesting, to say the least. But David is someone who cares about his people, someone who's with his people at this point. All right, our third question. This is from chapter 23. How does David inquire to find things out versus Saul in chapter 23? How do they both get access to information in this chapter?
Well, David would always, at every turn before he does anything, he inquires of the Lord.
Right.
And then when Abiathar brought the ephod, then he also consulted that to give God's response. Whereas Saul
Yeah.
I mean, he tried talking to God, but God had already turned on him and he would not answer.
Yeah. I think that's exactly what I'm looking for. When David wants access to information, he inquires, right? And he uses the things that are available to him. In verse 2, he inquired of the Lord, shall I go and attack these Philistines? And the Lord says, yeah, go do that. Almost immediately, right? Now, how does Saul get information in this chapter? Is it that quick? No. Saul has to go and he almost has to hear things secondhand every time he learns something in this chapter, right? Because this chapter is the one where Saul gets pretty close to David and he almost catches him, right? And he's hearing things constantly. Tears the kingdom, or when he says the kingdom is going to be torn from Saul, right? And this is the thing we've seen, right? He's becoming increasingly more out of the loop, if you will, right, with God. And that's not a good thing, right? He's kind of on the downhill path. And eventually, we're going to see in chapter 8 the clearest instance of that.
Yeah, you brought up verse 7. He still says, God has delivered David into my hand. Well, you know that's not so. But in his mind, he's still relying on God.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
That he would say that? God has delivered David into my hand. I don't know exactly what to do with that verse, but I think that's so interesting that he's still thinking of this through the lens of God in some way. You know, it's just really interesting. But yeah. All right, so David inquires of the Lord. Saul is not able to inquire like this. When he does, he gets a constant silence. It seems like everything in this chapter that Saul hears is what other people have said, right? Saul has to be told everything, as we see in verse 7, while David seems to have much more immediate access to information. And it just kind of goes to show how out of sync Saul is with God. All right, so we'll move on to chapters 24 through 26. Our first question here is, why does David feel like he's sinned against Saul even though he spared his life in chapter 24? Why does he feel that guilt to come out and tell Saul?
He has such a tender conscience. He knows that Saul is the Lord's anointed, and he repeats that theme even as he does these things. And his conscience is pricked.
Yeah. I think that is a big part of it, right? Part of what is going on here, I think, is there's a big inequity in the fact that, David refuses to touch the Lord's anointed. And when he does, just like the hem of his garment, he feels terrible about it. But on the other side of that spectrum, I guess, David is also the Lord's anointed at this point, right? And Saul has constantly been after David, right? And if Saul had had this opportunity, he wouldn't have given David the opportunity to live like David did to Saul. So I think we're meant to see that, is David is behaving one way, Saul is behaving in completely another.
It's a very interesting statement that the men of David tell him, behold, this is what God has said to him repeatedly, behold, I will give your enemy into your hand and you shall do to him as it shall seem good to you. That doesn't sound consistent with what God really told David. And it's certainly not consistent with what David expected, which was God would do it. He wouldn't put Saul into his hand to do what he wanted with him.
Right.
So I'm wondering whether they kind of twisted the message.
Yeah. They kind of suggest this to David and say, look, Saul's in the cave. Why don't you just go in there, do whatever you think is right, And obviously they want him to take the opportunity. But yeah, that's another great point.
Dave,
Oh.
Go on, sir.
Yeah.
Like 1 John 4:18 says, basically, in whom love is perfected, cast out fear, just paraphrasing. And so maybe by causing Saul to be afraid, knowing that, he could have killed him, maybe he felt like he should have just been like, hey, Saul,
Yeah.
maybe he felt bad for making him afraid.
Yeah, I think that's really, that's a good point as well.
He falls on his sword, and the messenger comes to see him, and he kills him.
Yeah.
And in Hebrews 6:6, we can still kill the Lord. We can crucify him over and over again if we don't repent of our sins.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I like, when Saul is initially in trouble in chapter 31 or 30, I think it's chapter 31, he asks his armor bearer to kill him, right? Just do this for me. And he won't do it because he's scared. So yeah, I think that's a really good, really important point.
I wonder too, if he felt he dishonored and disrespected Saul. I mean, that's why
Yeah.
even though he didn't kill him, he still did that.
Yeah.
I guess that put fear in him. The other thing is maybe just dishonored his position.
Yeah. Chapter 24, yeah, that's a really good point. Chapter 24 is really interesting because it's this reverse of situation, right? In chapter 23, Saul almost catches up with David. In chapter 24, it's the complete opposite, right? And David has all the power. And remember when we looked at Jonathan and how he strips himself of his garments and he gives them to David, right? And he makes that covenant with David. And what that signifies, right? He is the rightful heir, you would think, to Saul's kingdom. But instead, he divests himself of all his garments, right? Is very signatory of that role as his status as prince, right? And he gives that to David as this sign of like, I'm not going to be king. You're going to be king, and I recognize that very visibly. Well, here, I think it's kind of a similar thing going on. Saul's robes are part of his kingly office, right? They signify his right to rule. He is king. God did give him the role of king, and he's still acting in that role. He won't be king for much longer, but what is different? I didn't word this question very well, but what is different about why David, or how David is spared from bloodshed in chapter 25 verses 24? David has the opportunity to kill someone in all three chapters, 24, 25, and 26. 24 and 26 are kind of like mirror opposites or mirror images of one another. And David spares Saul both times. Chapter 25 is right in between them, and it's really interesting in that he requests assistance from Nabal. Nabal says no, and David is mad about that, and he's gonna go wipe Nabal out because he said no. I don't know if that was the right thing to do or not, but that's what he's decided to do. But he's again spared. The wife of Nabal, Abigail, comes to David and says, "Don't do this." So, what do we think about this whole episode? How's that different?
Well, in 24, he stopped, his conscience stopped him. In 25, the advice of somebody stopped him, and not only the advice of someone, but a woman.
Yeah.
In that era, I think that's pretty significant, and stopped him in his tracks.
Yeah, that's really important. Yeah. Here we see, before David's conscience bothered him, he came forward and was like, "Hey, I could have killed you. I didn't." And here he seems really bent on carrying through with the plan that he's deemed is appropriate. And it's a woman who stops him, right? It's Abigail. So he doesn't have that same, maybe, flag in his conscience that time, which is interesting.
What he was planning to do, God does for him. I think that's what he's waiting on happening to Saul. Eventually, God's going to do it, not him.
I think that's a really good point. The story so far has gone to great lengths to show how David is not involved in the active grasping of the kingdom. Right? He's not someone who takes the kingdom by force. It's given to him by God as he promised. Right? So this is maybe another similar instance where God actually does that. He gives David this victory. He removes the problem of Nabal for David before he acts rashly.
Well, that very point you're making is stated a couple of times about David not working salvation for himself. salvation for himself with Nabal. And really, that was the appeal, as Sylvia said. One was his conscience appealing, and one was Abigail appealing for that same principle. Really.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. He doesn't work salvation for himself in any of these stories, which is good.
Later on, when he becomes king, we'll see David, I think, make some rash moves and has executions ordered very quickly. But he's approaching it. His basic character is to listen. He's humble to God, and he's also, in this case, humble to the advice of David's wife, or her argument. And so that's the kind of man he was. He would listen.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that a lot. I think that's really important. There may be other times in David's life if we were to continue on in 2 Samuel, we're going to see that he is not good at listening, right? Nathan's going to come to him, and he's clueless, right? He gives him this parable, and David completely misses the point. But here, at this point in David's life, he listens. He's capable of hearing critique and dealing well with that, yeah.
We see Jesus in his interaction with Pilate, that Pilate said, "Don't you realize I have the authority to grant you life or to execute you?" And so we see a king has been given that kind of authority. But yet he's trying to make a determination what is right and what is wrong. And we see David, in this same situation. His first instinct is, I want to put him to death. But based on wise counsel, hearing the truth, he elected to let God make that determination of life or death.
Yeah.
Rather than taking that authority, which he was granted as the anointed of God.
Yeah.
But he did not want to be one who to abuse his authority.
Yeah. That's a good point. This next question here, I think, kind of flows really well with all of what we've been saying. We kind of been talking about this point already, and that is, why is it significant or important that David has refused to take the life of his enemies 3 times now? And I think that's a big part of it. He refuses to be the one who takes the kingdom for himself.
I don't think he's scared to kill anybody, because he's killed his 10,000.
Yes.
That's not the particular, what's keeping him from killing somebody.
Right.
It's why am I doing it? Is it the right reason for it?
Yeah. When Saul asks for 100 Philistines, David brings him 200, no problem at all. So, yeah. Yeah, so that, I feel like we've covered that question pretty well. But he's someone, David, as we've seen, is consistently shown to be someone who doesn't strive for the throne. He will not take it by his own power, right? But by providence, God's going to give him this gift, right, as prophesied. He told him that was going to happen that way.
Ethan, I think the modern day lesson there is that David respected the position of the king, even though the king didn't earn his respect.
Yeah.
And that translates today into respect the office, even if you don't respect the person of the president, the governor, the mayor. You still abide by their authority and comply with their laws.
Yeah. That's good. I think David did have a healthy respect for Saul still. Yeah. Of course, in chapter 25, Nabal, he's kind of the main bad guy of the chapter. Nabal, his name means fool or foolish. And then we get his wife Abigail, is completely the opposite, right? So they're a wonderful, interesting pair. I don't know how they got together, but they're just complete opposites. And this chapter also, to me, seems like it could be maybe just a sliver of an inner look into how David is kind of dealing with his present situation. Right? He's on the run. He has been for a while. And maybe the implicit question is, David, how are you going to deal with the long nights and the hard days and the things that you're currently being forced to endure, right? And when this difficulty comes up, initially, he's ready to go all in and just wipe Nabal out. But he's spared from that, which is interesting. But I think chapter 25 gives us the opportunity to see just a little bit more of David, if you will. All right, chapters 27 through 29. Our first question here is, are David's actions toward both King Achish and the towns that he raided in chapter 27 ethical, right? What's going on here? Why is nothing said about this? So the story here is, of course, David goes to King Achish, and he kind of teams up with King Achish, and he kind of becomes his confidant, right? He's kind of working for the Philistines at this point. And what happens is he tells King Achish, oh yeah, I went and raided this people and that people, and I took care of these guys for you. When in reality, he's actually going out and doing the exact opposite, and he's lying about it, and he's killing everyone so that they can't speak at all about it, right? Maybe that's the only way you could pull this off. But what's going on here? This seems really strange, and nothing is said about it. So what do we think? Oh, sorry. I mean to call on you before you said anything.
Wednesday night in here, we were studying the midwives in Egypt who lied about throwing the babies that were surviving.
Yeah.
And then God blessed them with children. There are just, and I was talking to Mark, there are moments in the Bible where somebody lied and they were rewarded. Rahab. And this seems to be, the people lied for something to protect God's people.
Yeah.
And that's what he was doing. He was killing off the bad guys and protecting God's people. And this seems to me to be one of those situations.
Right. Yeah. I think there's something to be said for the fact that David still isn't king. He's been anointed king, yes, but he still isn't king in the sense that he's in control. If he's not been made king by the people, like they'll do that later, and he doesn't have the resources that maybe Saul has at this point. And he's in a hard place, right? Saul is pursuing him. He's got Saul on his tail. What else are you supposed to do, right? He's kind of in a difficult spot, and he decides to make this work somehow, to be in league with King Achish, and asking the question, how is this right? It sort of maybe ignores the fact that David is in a hard spot, and he doesn't always have a choice. Yeah.
When the Israelites entered into the land, the people of Gilgal deceived the Israelites, Joshua and the Israelites, and they had the opportunity. They could have entered the land, and the same thing happens to us. If we're looking for the easiest way, we will be deceived. The tempter is out there wanting to itch our ears, so to speak. It's something we have to be wary of.
Yeah, that's true. He's got some bad management at this point, doesn't he? Right. He could check in, but
unfortunately, people tell lies.
Yeah.
And it's for their benefit, not for our benefit.
Yeah, you would think that he'd want to check in and make sure that's actually what's happening, because we're going to get to a point where David's loyalty is in question, and all the other Philistines are like, we don't trust this guy at all. And Achish is like, no, he's my buddy. We're good. He's going to fight for us, and he doesn't. Oh, we got several questions over here.
This reminds me of Jacob when he's with Laban
Yeah.
and Leah and Rachel, and he switches the cows. He
Yes.
does the breeding program. He's behind his back. He's doing that to multiply his stock.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, just reminded me of that.
Yeah. Laban or Jacob's not afraid to be a trickster at some points. We'll go down this way.
I was just gonna say that the Geneva Convention hadn't been written yet.
Yeah.
And so it's a mistake sometimes to judge people by our rules. What David's doing up there is probably was pretty common
Yeah.
in that time. Killing civilians wasn't against the rules.
No. Yeah. That's true.
I guess I have two things, like Jesus says the true worshipers are here
Yeah. I mean, you can't show up with all the stuff you've taken, and then your boss asks you about it, and then you got to say something, right? So, yeah, that's a good point.
I would just think it's wise to be cautious about making a moral judgment about his behavior when the Bible doesn't actually say anything. So we're imputing, reasons. I really don't think there's a good answer to.
King David, who, everyone's kind of measured against in the rest of the lines of kings, this is terrible. This is not a good thing, it seems like, to someone on the outside. It seems like this is pretty problematic. But we don't get a whole lot of evaluation of people's actions sometimes. And it's often just passed over. And we are left to sort of think about it on our own and reason through what's going on and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's a good point.
I just want to emphasize what she said, or what he said, that, when we draw the conclusion that since he wasn't punished, or since he wasn't praised, or wasn't condemned for this, that if we draw the conclusion that, situation ethics is right before God, then we have drawn the conclusion that his morality was right here, and we can't go that far with it.
Yeah. So I caution on both sides. I think we don't want to say, "Oh, this was totally cool with God," maybe, and we also don't want to say, "Oh, maybe," So that's a good point too. I get that. You want to maintain a balance there. And then this question: why does David consent to fight with King Achish in chapter 28? It's very similar to the one we just asked. I just think it's interesting. We don't actually see David do this, but Achish said to David in chapter 28, verse 1, he says, "You know, of course, that you and your men are to go out with me in the army." It's almost like he's saying, "All right, I've trusted you. We're going to test you out now, David. Are you with me or not?" And David says to Achish, "Very well. Then you shall know what your servant can do." So it seems like David's going to go ahead and go to battle, presumably against the Israelites, right? And that doesn't end up happening, right? The other Israelite lords end up stepping in and saying, "No way we're going to let him go to battle with us. He's going to double cross us." But I mostly bring this question up just to note that it's interesting that David, we aren't given an indication of what he's thinking, but it's just so fascinating to think about what he might be thinking, right? Does he mean this? Is he just sort of saying this to King Achish to perform, if you will? We don't really know, but it's an ambiguous moment in the story, and one that is good to think about. And then, of course, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but what is Samuel's final word to Saul in chapter 28? 2 questions on chapter 28.
Well, that he will be delivered to the Philistines, and that he and his sons will be dead. So they'll be with him.
Yeah.
With Samuel, who is dead.
Right. Essentially, not a whole lot's changed since the last time they talked. Kingdom's going to be torn from you. That's the basic message. And of course, he tells him he's going to die, so that's new and troubling to Saul. But it's a very similar message, right? Nothing has really changed. He goes to all this length to talk to Samuel and find a medium and have her call him up, however that works, or however what we're supposed to think about that. And he says pretty much the same thing. You're not going to be king for much longer. And that's a really, I think we understand why as readers. Saul has not been good for the kingdom. So we understand that this is a good thing in some sense. But it's also kind of a tragic moment. This is Saul. He started out really great. And he had a lot of promise. And this is where he's at now, right? Seeking out a medium who he's banished from the land. By his orders, he made the order that they be abolished, or that mediums shouldn't exist anymore. And here he is seeking one out. So there's also the irony there.
purposefully put them out of the land by God's decree,
Yeah. Yes.
but not to death, just to exile.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Thank you for that. All right. We won't spend a whole lot of time on that section because we have 3 final questions. Why is it significant that David gains this defeat over the Amalekites in chapter 30? Right, why is that important?
Well, for one, the men are about to stone him. They're so upset that their families were taken. But
Yeah.
on the other hand, I think he has to be victorious so he can be respected and honored when he's king later.
Yeah. David's still got a lot to prove, and he's got to keep his men happy. I would be pretty distraught as well if that had just happened to me. But specifically, I'm thinking, it's mentioned that these are Amalekites. And who did Saul, what was his big failure in chapter 15?
Not totally destroyed.
He didn't totally destroy them. He spares King Agag, and then there's this, I don't know, it's kind of dark but also humorous moment where Samuel cuts King Agag to pieces before everyone. Because Saul couldn't do it, or wouldn't do it. And I think this is kind of showing, David is doing what Saul couldn't, or at least in part. So I think that is important there. For chapter 31, why might the men of Jabesh Gilead take the risk to recover Saul's body in chapter 31? Why go through that? Why do that?
Because Jonathan and others had actually helped to rescue them at the earlier point of Saul. Saul had sent an army to go and rescue them when they were besieged, or expected to be besieged and killed.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an acknowledgement and recognition of the help that they'd been given historically.
Yes, yeah. Essentially, Saul had saved Jabesh Gilead earlier in chapter 11. They probably feel a great debt to Saul. That makes a lot of sense. So not a whole lot of discussion to that one. It's pretty straightforward. But the final one, I really we'll talk about till the kids come out. But how does God work on us through the book of 1 Samuel? Right? How are we shaped as we read it? Right? And this could maybe be more of a personal answer, how you feel like you've been shaped and formed as you read through the book of 1 Samuel, or it could be more general. But I'm interested in that.
One of the things I thought about is vengeance is mine, says the Lord. So, because we today, we get accosted in different ways, either on the road or family or whatever, friends who betray us or talk about us or just something. And we want to retaliate. And so we need to let the Lord take care of things.
That is excellent, yes. I think that's a big theme we see through Samuel. So, yeah.
I think like a pivotal moment is when, for me at least, when Saul receives a new heart, and then he goes away with a different heart. And it just, to me, it showed that, even if God gives you a new heart, you can still, if you don't follow and submitting to that new heart, then you can mess it up.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. He was a changed person, but that doesn't mean he still didn't fail miserably later. So, yeah, that's good.
Related to that, God looks at the heart. Men look at stature, they look at wealth, they look at other factors. And so that's, despite David's failures, at this point there aren't many. Later there'll be more. He had a heart for the Lord and to listen to him, to seek his wisdom and to glorify God.
Yeah. That's a great point. Yeah. God works through all of these people because he sees that. One thing I wanted to emphasize as we kind of come to a close is through these narratives of Samuel and David and Saul and Eli and all these people, I think if we're open and if we're reflective enough and we're honest with ourselves, we get a look of ourselves in these people. We've talked about this before. This isn't new, but these books are a lot like a mirror, right? If we're open and honest with ourselves, we get a look at the paranoid Saul in ourselves, and we can see traces of that sort of behavior in us, right? When we look at the seemingly idolatrous request for a king, and we we see that in us, right? We all have idolatrous tendencies. Ours isn't for a king necessarily, like theirs was, but there's all sorts of stuff that we want to rule over us, like they did. We're often idolatrous as well. And I think the invitation of 1 Samuel is to recognize that, of course, and to commit ourselves to letting God work in and through us from the inside out, just like God does with the request for a king. Right, the answer to this idolatrous request of the Israelites is actually in the institution itself, it seems. Right? God says, if they want a king, I'm going to give them a king. Right? He acquiesced to their request. But God actually works through the failures of each king in Israel to bring about that greater good that He's working for them. Right? I think of Genesis 50, when Joseph says to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, God meant it for good." Right? And eventually, one day, once Israel has lost all of its kings because of their sin and their foolishness, and they are in exile, and because of their covenant disloyalty, eventually God actually comes to Israel Himself. Right? And He chooses to set the course right by dying on behalf of their sins and behalf of our sins. Right? So that the greatest good of all can be accomplished. And so that we can dwell with Him in harmony, right? As man once did. That is the end of our class. I hope we did an okay job wrapping up the whole thing. I know we had a lot to cover. I know it was probably a lot. We really did go fast. But again, thank you guys. Thank you for your questions, your comments. You guys really made this class what it was. So thank you.